But if I'm really being honest, just the mental health connection, if you're not able to see the world as it is, there's a vulnerability there, and it could surface as suffering.
So welcome to Bearing the How podcast, episode number 7. Today I have Hunter Michael back on. Hunter was the very first guest. He got this going with me. He was the first person that I reached out to, and he was kind enough to come on, and now he's kind enough to come back on. So how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for asking.
Awesome. So the structure that I've been doing is I have a little bullet point that we talked about, a little bullet point list of topics to discuss. And like I was saying, I kind of want to have this be a good podcast for me to practice interviewing. So I thought I'd ask you questions and let you talk. I really love a lot of the things that you talk about, and there's a lot that I want to learn from you. By the way, I've been meditating every single day since
you have.
Every day.
That's great.
It's been awesome. Yeah, it's been a huge change.
That's great.
Actually consistently doing it every day. You know, it's different than doing it every now and then.
It is.
Definitely makes a big difference.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask, when do you meditate and what do you do?
So I usually meditate at night and like kind of right before I go to bed.
Okay.
And I'll just sit actually over here in this chair, and I do like closing my eyes, focusing on my breath, I guess. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I fall asleep a lot of the time.
That happens.
But it helps. Like it really helps. I feel when I wake up and actually go get in bed, I feel like, I don't know, that feeling, you know, that kind of clear feeling. Yeah, it's awesome. And it definitely helps with
great.
Sleep better and everything.
I'm glad to hear it.
It's been really cool.
Yeah, what a cool practice.
So thank you. Yeah, it was really good inspiration. I thought maybe, so there's a lot of stuff on here. Like there's a lot we could go into. Wherever this goes is where it goes. So, but I thought I would just start with kind of one of the first things that you sent me in the email that you sent me, which is your travels in Spain. I haven't done a ton of traveling, definitely want to, but you talked about traveling to Spain and learning Spanish, and you mentioned about learning Spanish, kind of being a novice at the language is a good way to humble yourself or learn about humility. So I'm curious, like why travel to Spain, and what was your experience with Spain and learning Spanish and everything?
Yeah, that was a big episode in my life, and so there's a lot to say, but I can give just the broad strokes.
Yeah, that was a broad question.
Yeah, no,
whatever you want to talk about.
It taught me a lot, maybe more than any one experience.
Yeah,
and I was there for about half a year, and then I've been back a bunch of times since then. So in aggregate, I've spent a lot of time there, and I'm not the only person to study abroad or to do something like that. But it also now, just at my age, it teaches me that, or it reminds me that having a nice narrative is something that's really convenient to say, oh, and then I did this and this and this.
For sure.
So I don't have that. To be perfectly honest, I don't know exactly what I was thinking. I was 17, and I just, I do remember that I was a little bored in high school. A friend of mine had suggested, hey, did you know that you can just go live with a family in another country and go to school there, and you get all the high school credit, but you basically have to disenroll from your current high school, go abroad, and then you just hope it works out.
So you're in high school when you first
I was in high school.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really cool.
So I was a senior, and just, applied for a program and a scholarship and saved up money. And it in some ways it was very formal, and it was so the humility comes up when I thought about how special you can feel doing something like that, and simultaneously how irrelevant and ordinary. Yeah. So I spent months and months planning this trip and adjusting my life and organizing everything around it. And didn't know the language hardly at all. I was not great at Spanish, and didn't know anything about the country of Spain. And we had an orientation and spent a few days beforehand knowing what to expect.
Gotcha.
They connect you with a family, but that's kind of it, And I remember the family that I was with one family for a few weeks before I actually switched. But I asked the host mom, okay, so, I got to go to school, right? And she said, yeah, on Monday, just go to school. And I did not know what school meant, and I did not know where it was. And she was like, yeah, up on the hill. Very, very vague. Not that helpful. And I ended up switching families partially for that reason. But
Gotcha.
And then stayed with one family for the bulk of that trip. but so it's interesting. Your whole life leads up to some moment, and you show up at school, and you're eager. And I was terrified. Also, couldn't understand anybody, and so you're feeling very unique in that way, very special.
Yeah.
And my life is extraordinary and different, and kind of expecting that treatment.
Yeah.
And I got none of it. And everyone else is just a Spaniard living their life and just going to school, just like we all did in the United States.
Yeah.
So they really didn't care that much about me and my unique circumstances.
I mean, that's a really interesting perspective. Like, because I remember transfer students at my high school, and I always thought that it was so cool that you came and transferred here, and like that's like
crazy.
Exchange
students. And,
foreign exchange.
Gotcha,
that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Not transfer students. And I always thought it was so interesting, but I mean, do you mind me asking why Spain?
Yeah, that was also a weird process of elimination. I wanted to go to a non-English speaking country in order to learn a language.
That's a risk.
Yeah. And my grandfather lives in Central America, in Costa Rica, actually. And I had been down there, and I thought, I want to go somewhere other than where I've been, or at least regionally. And I thought Europe would be cool because I had never been there.
Yeah.
So it left me with one option, essentially. Cool. And something about not actually knowing anything about the country, I think, was a little alluring to me. And again, I don't have a perfect memory of my thought pattern at age 17.
Yeah.
But I kind of just chose it and went with it.
That's
and
cool.
I was going to go with that friend of mine that had suggested the idea, but I just ended up going alone, and other things worked out for that friend. But
that is so interesting that at 17 you decided to go to another country and do that.
Yeah. And I was in my program, other people had been assigned to, you go to this mass orientation, and then you get distributed to your cities that they've paired you with. And so there were I think 5 other students who were also my age from around the world who were in my city.
Yeah.
And meeting them is interesting too, because you also think, what would compel somebody to do something like this?
Yeah.
And they all had kind of different reasons. A lot of them, their families could send them abroad, some of them for a year because it looks good for college,
Gotcha.
or it's maybe their parents just wanted to get them out of the house, or if they're from nearby countries, it wouldn't have been that big of a transition for some of them.
Yeah.
Some of them from Germany. I mean, the language, but it's all, same money, currency, and things like that. So, you show up the first day of school, and it's a little weird.
Yeah. So you think the humility comes in when not only the perception that you had that like, oh, I'm doing something special, when that kind of goes away, but also the just completely being in an unknown environment where you don't speak the language, you're having to just jump into this whole new thing. Like that's where you think the humility, and I definitely like talking about that, like the humility, kind of being humble. It's a struggle that I went through for sure. It took me a long time to kind of, I don't like to say like, oh, now I'm a perfectly humble. No one's like a perfectly humble person, but I do think that there is a moment in everyone's life where you become like aware of how important it is to try to be more, humble. But anyway, so do you speak Spanish? Like you're pretty good. Say something in Spanish.
Algo en español.
You got to teach me. My crew actually at my job, they all speak Spanish. We have one that doesn't actually even speak English. I know poquito español, but I definitely need to learn. So let's do that. If you don't mind, I'd love to learn.
Yeah, the use it or lose it applies also. So if you begin to learn a language, my recommendation is always
learn it. Sorry to interrupt, but did you learn it there? Like in the field?
Oh yeah. I had a little high school grammar foundation, and I had a little exposure before going, but also it's the Castilian accent is significantly different than what I was used to.
Gotcha.
And I remember these snapshot moments where it really helps to be really embarrassed to learn something like that. You really don't make the same mistake twice in those situations. Yeah. And a lot of anecdotal stuff, but I remember first the family that I was paired with was there were a little bit of an exchange student mill. They hosted a lot of students, and the host mom, I don't know how else to say it, didn't really care about the experience of the
Gotcha.
students she was hosting. She just liked the fact that it was kind of easy, and she had young kids, and it was really difficult. So the first day I got to my city, she walked me home. Didn't have anything to say. We get in there, and she told me, and okay, well, I have to go run some errands. So here's a house key. Be back by 8 for dinner,
Gotcha.
and then left.
And she spoke
So-
English?
No, this was in Spanish.
Oh,
yeah.
gotcha. Ooh.
So we could communicate like that, yeah. And she bailed. So I remember standing alone in the middle of this house. It was really hot during summertime, and knowing not where I was or how to communicate very well with anybody.
Sorry, we're back. Technical difficulty. So you were talking about being completely alone in the middle of this house.
Right. Yeah. And so I kind of wandered around the city and just found my way back home in order to get familiar with it. And you meet people and speak to people, or they speak to you, whether you like it or not. And then sharing situations. So I stayed in that house for about 3 weeks, and then got transferred to another family who was actually a Spanish family.
Okay.
And my host mom, my mom and dad were both very bright people. My host mom was kind of a bizarre person also. She was really, really superstitious, and she had a 9-year-old daughter. And so I had the luxury of having a child level Spanish. I mean, even a 9-year-old in any country is going to be more fluent than an adult can ever hope to be. So I learned a lot in that way, but you could speak about basic stuff, and so that was instructive. But even getting in conflicts and arguments and debating things and negotiating things, it all floods back to you. Whatever you do know, you can draw upon that. So it's really hard to just Rosetta Stone something without internalizing it and making it a real fabric of your environment.
Gotcha. So how would you, just for anyone listening that might want to learn a new language, what would be like practical advice? I'm a good candidate. Like, what would you say tomorrow I should start doing to try to learn Spanish?
Good question. My most simple piece of advice that I would give somebody is put yourself in a situation where you have to use the language to get out of it.
Gotcha.
So it's fun and everything when you can meet your friend's mom who speaks another language, and you can kind of practice and talk about what's for dinner. But if you really agree, I'm going to go to an event with this person who speaks another language, or I'm going to be hosted at their house where I can't do anything until I'm able to communicate with them.
Gotcha.
And you don't fall back on maybe that person knows English, or you can gesture your way out of it. And somewhere where you really test your ability to use the language fluidly. So instead of memorizing a greeting, hi, how are you? Good, thanks. How are you? I'm good. Where are you from? Those kinds of things that are memorized, where you have to create new sentences and new ideas in that language, always is going to work better.
Cool. So that's good advice.
Be embarrassed.
Yeah.
You'll embarrass yourself.
That my work environment is perfect for that. And I've been, because there's one employee we have who doesn't speak, she doesn't speak English. And I mainly communicate with her like body language and that kind of thing. I know a little bit, but I think that's good advice. I'm going to start tomorrow with like trying to way more specifically communicate to her, like with specificity. And I think that'll help a lot.
Right. And just for the record, just for also anyone listening, languages are not necessarily, languages are predictable in a lot of ways, insofar as they have a syntax and a grammar, and the sounds are more or less random. Languages evolve, and then different, dog means dog for historical reasons, not for physical reasons. But once you know how to put those things together, you can guess your way out of situations. So if you have a little syntactic foundation, you can learn, these are the patterns of this language. You don't just have to memorize every sentence, every construction.
That's what a lot of people do when they try to learn a new language. That's what I've tried to do, and I never have learned another language.
It's vocabulary you have to memorize, plain and simple. But they do have structure. So I recommend that too. Getting into that.
I definitely would love to travel to Spain myself. That would be.
I recommend it.
Definitely always have.
Certainly.
So there was something else you sent me in this email, kind of vague, and I'd love for you to go into depth with it. But you talk about how you work with the deaf community. Yeah. And you talk about how I don't want to say too much. I'll let you talk about it. But you talk a little bit about how it's helped you, I guess, realize how to live a fulfilling life. a little bit more. And you said something really interesting too that I never really have thought about, but it was really interesting that you met some deaf people that think of it as more of a character trait.
Right.
And then you have other ones that think of it as something that holds them back. So I would love for you to just talk about your work with deaf community, what you've learned and what you mean by seeing it as a character trait. And,
Sure. Yeah. So that's a long-standing controversy in the deaf community also that, honestly,
So
I got into it. Yeah. And I met my first deaf friend when I was, I think 15-ish. And great guy, and we used to hang out together, and I learned sign primarily through him. And then it's kind of a snowball effect. You meet another friend, and then you meet their friends, and then you go to deaf events and deaf parties and all that. And it's also this culture and this community that, so it's another language, and kind of like the moving to another country and learning their language. There's that element to it where when you're in, and it's a self-maintaining system. Everyone signs and everyone, but it's also interesting because it's determinant. So being deaf, it's not like a deaf person will eventually just learn to hear and speak the way we do, right? They don't have that option.
Yeah.
In ways, they have options to improve just through hearing, hearing aids or cochlear implants and things like that. And sign language is a language in and of itself. So there's nothing that you can't say in sign language that you could say in another language.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But so you, anyway, in my spending time with a bunch of deaf people early on, you notice that life is significantly different for these people in a way that it's not just different because you speak German instead of English or Japanese.
It's a huge
pretty
difference.
different.
Yeah.
So the controversy, just to sum it up very, very simply, is that in the deaf empowerment movement in the community, there would be a value of not letting your deafness hold you back in a way where you can be deaf and you can be a pilot, you can be deaf and you could be a teacher, you could be deaf and you basically do what everyone else can do. This would be the argument against deafness as being an intrinsic disability.
Yeah.
And there was a, I don't know if it was a public service announcement or commercial almost. I don't know what it would have been advertising, but there's a video clip of a person wandering around a really crowded city, like New York or something, and asking for directions. I think they're holding a map. I'm not sure if I remember this. And everyone else is deaf. So everyone's signing. And the hearing person who's trying to speak to people is the only one who can't communicate with them.
Gotcha.
So the lesson is, depending on the community you're in, if you're deaf in a hearing community, sure, there's a barrier. But if you're hearing in the deaf community, the hearing person's at the disadvantage.
Yeah.
So that would be the one line of thinking. The other opposition would be the kind of what I described. If you're deaf, you can't necessarily learn to hear. Whereas if you're hearing, you can learn to sign and communicate with the deaf.
Yeah.
So if you are deaf and you want to access disability benefits, or you need accommodations or interpreters, you have to use that element and say, essentially, yeah, I'm at a disadvantage in a classroom, I need an interpreter. But once you have the interpreter, you can learn the material just the same.
Yeah.
So I began assistant teaching and then teaching deaf and hard of hearing elementary school classes, and some are like special day classes where everyone in the room is deaf, and then some of the mainstream, which means they go to normal classes and they do all the normal schoolwork just with an interpreter, and I interpreted for them too. So yeah, but when you're an adult and all your deaf friends grow up and you're just living your life and working normal jobs, it's interesting to watch how deaf people just make it work.
Yeah, I think that is so interesting, and I'm curious too if you like people who are born deaf and then people who go deaf. The difference. I don't know if you have friends that are in both of those.
Yeah,
but
certainly.
I've always wondered about that, like what that must be like going deaf rather than being born deaf, like being able to hear and then going to a place where you're not able to hear, and how you cope with that or how you move forward with that. Because I really like how you said it helped you learn about living a fulfilling life, and that's something I like talking about on the podcast. But I'm just curious, like.
So another interesting thing about deafness is that it's quite a spectrum. So some people are what you call profoundly deaf, and they have very little hearing. Almost nobody is completely deaf, absolutely no sound input, unable to use their ears.
Gotcha.
Kind of like blindness. There's something there. But there are also people who are on the higher end of that spectrum. Maybe veterans that come back with some or musicians that have
that's a worry
damage.
I have. I listen to my music way too loud all the time.
A lot of people do, and we could all be a little more responsible in that way. But there's then there's everything in between. So there's somebody who is deaf in one ear or is hard of hearing, but with hearing aids has basically normal hearing. There's a person who went deaf when they were 18 and they still have all their same vocal abilities because they've spent their whole life speaking and hearing, versus the person who's never had an auditory input. They were born deaf and they don't know what quote unquote normal speech even sounds like. So every time you meet someone, or at least maybe this is just me, but I love to meet people and just ask about their deafness in a way. Hey, I know, you have a cochlear. How's that working? What's your hearing percentages in each ear? How deaf are you? Could you hear that? Could you hear this?
Gotcha.
And then you can learn. And then there are strong correlations with everything else, with language, with deaf people's grammar. If they're writing something, because American Sign Language grammar is different than spoken English.
Gotcha.
So things will seem different on paper. But just so as far as individual differences go, we all didn't choose our circumstances. And so it's inspired me a lot. I watch my deaf friends and deaf people, deaf clients, just navigate the world. And if I told you tomorrow, sorry, you'll never be able to hear again, that'd be pretty devastating news.
Yes.
And it would change your life a lot.
Yeah.
So it also helped growing up to put in perspective, some losses are worse than others.
Yeah.
And I should be so lucky to have all my senses and be able to learn sign language to speak to these awesome people, because I was never going to meet them otherwise,
No, it is really inspiring to think about it that way. Like to think about, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are deaf, and to think about it's like overcoming this obstacle. And especially if you could hear and then you can't hear. It happened, you lost your hearing.
Yeah.
Just that choosing, it's something that we talk about on this podcast, but like you could, I'm sure you have that moment where you feel like this is unfair. Why did this happen to me? But you choose to not be a victim and overcome that and live a really fulfilling life. It's like kind of going back to the humility thing too. That's, and I'm curious about sign language. It's such an interesting, I know like when I was younger, I had, there were people in my school that were deaf and used sign language. And it always was such an interesting thing. And I never thought about it as a full-blown language until later, getting older and then realizing the intricacies of it. And you can go into depth with sign language, but it's really interesting. You know sign language?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what was that like, learning sign language as another language? Like if you think about it, like this is a full-blown language.
It's fun. People tend to like it. And in a way that people don't always love learning Cantonese, let's say, because it's very difficult. Signing perfectly is just as difficult as speaking other languages perfectly. But also I had the same experience with Spanish too. If you are in the situation with the person, and if you're with someone kind and patient enough to teach you and bear with you, then it works pretty well. Yeah. So the benefit of American Sign Language is you can use the English alphabet. So you can spell whatever you don't know. You can spell a word and they'll sign it to you. So you have this real-time experience. Whereas if I were learning Japanese and I didn't know how to say something in Japanese, I'd have to mimic it or I'd have to describe it with my words, which I also might not have.
Yeah.
So you have this common access to a vocabulary that you don't have with other spoken languages. Yeah. And it's nice. You get to know a friend. And so I'm saying you, but I wanted to really get to know this person and these people, this whole community. So it was every incentive that I needed to want to get better at it, right?
Man. Yeah, that's really badass.
Yeah.
So do you speak any other languages? Or?
I learned some Valenciano when I was in. It's a regional language in Spain where I happen to be, but Valenciano was a mandatory class for everyone of my age. But it's not something I speak on a regular basis.
Awesome. That's inspiring. Yeah. I gotta get it together and learn Spanish. Definitely.
Yeah.
Any tips you have?
And Duolingo is a great app.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. I really like it. I use it for other
Yeah,
languages.
I even learning sign language seems like it'd be super. It's a like language in general is such an interesting topic. Like how we even. I know Yuval Harari talks about language. Like we what does he say? We created language or we evolved to speak to gossip. It's such an interesting thing.
Basically,
yeah. I mean, but it's really interesting sign language. Have you seen that video? By the way, it just popped in my head of that woman that was like interpreting at some police thing, and she was just completely bullshitting the sign language. So ridiculous. Like, what do you think about that? Just is that like? Would you consider that funny, or would you consider that kind of like offensive that she would do that?
If I'm thinking of the same thing, it's what happened in. I could be totally wrong. The interpreter for Obama in South Africa, I want to say, there was a guy who was one of the first cases. I was just amazed that they passed all the security protocol.
Yeah,
how did that person get to that place?
Why the hell did that person do it? I never looked into it.
Oh, I have no idea. So
weird.
I don't know if I'm thinking of the same, but there are. Yeah, I have no idea what's going on in those people's head, but I do sometimes. Well, there's a weird framing effect where I can imagine a person showing up to an event saying, "Oh, well, I'm the interpreter," and because the person in charge might be so unfamiliar with what that means or what those kinds of credentials look like, or how you would screen for that the person ends up in this position that's very privileged. I mean, the guy that was right next to, I think it was Obama that the guy was interpreting for.
That makes
like
sense.
10 feet away, no one gets that close without a very, very thorough screening. So it kind of worries me that wasn't going on there. Somebody failed along the way.
Ridiculous. But I just thought I just popped into my head that little video.
I recommend it.
And a lot of
though.
people laugh at it. A lot of people laugh at like these people faking it, but it's one of those things that if you're not in the deaf community, you don't think about it really in too much depth, like what that meant, or if there are people there anyway.
Change your perspective. Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff on here. I'm kind of curious.
Well, also, actually, language is a good segue to something I was thinking. I like that Yuval also notices that language is basically arbitrary. I love the field of linguistics, and I'm not a linguist, so there are people out there so much more knowledgeable about these things. But as a consumer, one of the big takeaways for me is that just because there's a word for something or that we use a word in a certain way doesn't mean that it's prescriptive or normative. Languages emerge and just there's nothing intrinsically there's nothing materially real about a language. Like I was saying, like the word dog doesn't have anything to do with the shape or the texture of a canine. It just happens to be the sounds that emerged over history. I say dog, you say dog, and we know what we mean, and we just point to the same thing.
It's really crazy. To really think about the evolution of language, the amount of different languages, almost like I wonder what the world would be like if sign language, like using your hands to communicate primarily, became the primary language.
Well,
rather than
I believe
the sounds
signs
we make.
were sign language or bodily movements in order to communicate were predated speech. So I think I couldn't give you a citation on that, but I've heard linguists talk about that people would pantomime to each other, and then those pantomimes transcended the shape of that movement. Like if I talk about drinking, but then certain signs actually mean something that it doesn't look like. So I was re-listening to this Antonio Damasio talk with Sam Harris on Sam Harris's book club, and he notices that consciousness, the word, and conscience don't, for example, in Romance languages, there's not two words for those. It's the same. It's basically the word conscience is consciousness, and then you hash it out in real time, and you say, no, I don't mean conscience like the voice in your head, like the moral conscience. I mean like being a sentient being consciousness. And
that's interesting.
And so just because we have a word for consciousness doesn't mean that it is something, and conscience is a different thing per se. I mean, we figure it out later, but naming these things is also up to us. It's kind of a post hoc word. Like,
Yeah.
you know, that other thing, not just conscience, that other thing that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
We go, yeah, sure. And then we kind of make up a word for it.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
so we often have words that that we don't need, or words that we do need that we don't have.
Yeah.
And I just,
What was the
like to think
plug
about
you
that.
wanted to make, by the way, before we started?
Oh, just on that note, it's just fresh in my mind. So I hear this a lot working in the therapy community
Yeah.
too. Antonio Damasio differentiates feeling from emotion from rationality, or what we might call logic.
Yeah.
And I hear people say that this is a logical person, or this is an emotional person, and you really, they're not separate things. And so I don't like to tell people how to speak, but I would encourage, anyone listening, again, just it challenged me, and I think for the better. I like it's kind of uncomfortable, but I like the effect that it had on me. That when I'm inclined to think of something as being just emotional, or when I think of a feeling and an emotion being the same thing, Antonio dispelled that.
Gotcha.
That
What's the name? Is this a book you're talking about?
I don't know the name of his actual book where he
Gotcha.
most recently talks about this,
Gotcha.
but you can look him up easily.
The Sam Harris thing you were telling
Sam
me
Harrison
about.
and Antonio
You have to be
Damasio had a
subscriber.
great conversation.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I'll look into that for sure. Sounds really interesting.
Excuse me. But I like how connected those things are, and I notice how people will often privilege something like being a logical or reasonable person.
Yeah, for sure.
In my mind, reasonable can be different than being logical. Like, you can be reasonable in that you are taking into account all of the data, or you're reasoning with perhaps about emotions.
Yeah.
But when people think, oh, that's a very rational or logical person, and this person's not,
Yeah.
I get semantically what people mean when they say logical. Usually means that you're not reactive, let's say, or you're not dramatic.
Yeah, I was
or
just about to ask you that. How would you, if you had to define logical, reasonable, emotional? I mean, what would you say is kind of I guess what other people often say, like when someone says, "Oh, you're a really reasonable guy," like what do they mean by that, really?
Yeah,
What do you think, at least?
Well, so like I said, I'm sympathetic to the common way that we use these words, because no one, we talked about this before too,
Yeah.
that I couldn't produce a really good dictionary definition for almost any word that I use. If you look in the dictionary, you'll almost always be surprised by how exact these definitions are, and how poorly we do that on our own, and yet how well we communicate in spite of that. So anyway, just going back there,
Gotcha.
I get if someone comes to me and is describing a friend that I don't know, and they say, yeah, he's a really rational guy. I'm interpreting that as meaning that this person isn't flying off the handle and making flippant, impulsive decisions, and is unable to cope with their moment-to-moment experience, and that maybe they're even a little cold and dry in their calculations. And just so cool. And when someone says, "Oh, my friend," it's just that they're so emotional. I also understand that person to be all those things that I named. Maybe a little impulsive, or maybe just very, very intuitive and feeling, and that could be a good thing. And however, when I think of that rational person, the way Antonio Damasio describes it, again, if I'm getting this all perfect, which I'm sure I'm not, that you have a feeling, which is a subjective experience, an inner experience, and that in turn produces an emotion. An emotion also has motion in it, and that's not a coincidence. That you produce an observable physical effect. So I could start trembling, my heart rate could change, I could start sweating, my pupils could dilate, a lot of things could happen.
Yeah.
And you can observe what that is. So you might have a feeling that produces an ambiguous emotion, or you might have an emotion and not even be aware of the feeling that's going on. And then you can make a decision based on your rationale or your rationality at the moment, where the rationality really is I guess I would describe it as just the raw, it's the game of Frogger that gets you from one side to the other, and you just hop from one thing to another, and the logic just gets you all the connective tissue.
Gotcha.
So you can't really be rational without an emotion or a
Yeah,
feeling.
I'm curious to ask you about this. I know you're a big Sam Harris fan. You said that you've read all of his books, and I love, like, I really do like Sam Harris a lot, and I like the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, that dynamic. I just love both of them, like the openness. I think they're just admirable people, honestly. But I haven't like gone into Sam, like I haven't read any of his books, and I've just recently kind of started to get into his podcast more, and I really like a lot of the stuff he says. He talks about rationalism a lot, and on this last podcast I did with Chris, we kind of got into the whole like using rationalism, and I'm curious because I don't want to put words in Sam Harris's mouth. I don't want to. I'm not yet knowledgeable enough on his ideas, but I'm curious, like, if you don't mind helping me understand a little bit what Sam Harris is kind of like. What is he trying to do with his content that he creates? Because just very quickly, to me, it seems like he's kind of trying to say you don't need religion. And I know that I know he said this, like, I don't want to quote and say this is exactly what he said, but I know he said like religion, he thinks religion is like a net negative. I think in one of the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debates, he actually said like he thinks religion is an like overall negative thing. And Chris and I got into the discussion of, I know and maybe it's just a complete misunderstanding of what I see rationalism as, but we talked a little bit about how you can use your rationality to justify doing horrible things, and maybe that's like a semantic
I don't know how that's
thing.
possible.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just that I'm defining rationality wrong, but like, and I don't know what the word would be to describe it, but people can use, I mean, okay, before I keep going, what is rationality exactly? Like, what, just generally? I know you can't like define it exactly, but
what I'm understanding, reason, rationality, logic. This might be one of those cases where three words kind of mean the same thing.
Yeah,
but I don't think rationality in and of itself gives you any conclusion. I mean, I don't know what. It'd be like a computer with no software, with no input. Like if I said, what is a calculator really trying to tell me?
Gotcha.
Right? That question doesn't really make sense.
Gotcha. So it's
There's
like
no
more
goal.
of a tool, you think? Like rationality is a tool.
That's the way I understand it, is that if you're using facts to get to an end goal or to try to figure out what might be real, then you use rationality. And
no, that makes a lot of sense. Which you could argue. I think that's the argument. The reason Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris have such this heated debate is because Jordan Peterson says it's not enough. Rationality isn't enough for some people, and so this is why I don't want to say that this is what Sam Harris says. But it seems like Sam Harris says rationality should be enough, though, to get you to live like a more meaningful life where you can try to approach that ultimate well-being. But if it's just a tool and there's no, like, if it's just a tool and you can't really achieve an outcome from it, then how can you just use rationality rather than having some like underlying value structure, I guess, would be the question,
Yeah. I have a couple reactions to this.
Yeah.
One is just a semantic one, which is there's a great clip of Steven Pinker on YouTube and from I think years ago where it's just Steven Pinker on reason, and he says if somebody comes to you and is trying to convince you of something, or once you and I have engaged in a dialogue where we're trying to see eye to eye or trying to persuade one another of something, we have to give reasons for that. So it's not. So there are ways of not using reason, like if I put a gun to your head and I say, just tell me that you agree with me, right? I don't want a reason. I just want the outcome.
Gotcha.
If I, and there are cliches along those lines. If I said, might is right, whoever happens to be in charge should be in charge. Most people know that that's flawed. That's off. And most, I mean, I say most people, I don't know, but if you talk to somebody and you ask them, do you think that's true? My guess is they'll give you a reason that they think that is either true or false. And if you think that there's a better and a worse way of doing something, or that there's that somebody's mistaken about something, that whatever that process is, I don't care what we call it, but whatever that process is, that's what I understand reasoning to be.
Okay.
So if I'm being rational, I'm just accounting for the data that we have or the information at hand. So I don't know. I don't think it's possible to say somebody is using rationality and that's a bad thing. They might be reasoning poorly.
I see what you're saying.
right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that you can't put the blame on like rationality.
Rationality,
What I was
thing.
saying, sorry to interrupt, but
No,
like what I was
yeah,
saying is like people who commit like crimes, people who commit atrocious crimes, like school shooters and stuff, they in their minds, and you know, not every case or anything, but you can read about some of the things that these people think about and say, and it's they're justifying why they're doing it, and you know, there are people that even make intelligent cases as to why it is better for them to do like atrocious things, and then that's why I was saying, well, isn't that using irrationality? But it like you said, it makes a lot of sense to just think of it as, it's not like you can't put the blame on it. It's just a tool. It's just like a tool.
Well,
you know,
can I give you an example that always strikes me? The behavioral economics field also blows my mind every time I read a new book or discover a new researcher in that field. So what game theory and altruism taught me also, especially from an evolutionary standpoint, people would say, especially 100 years ago or more, would say, well, it's rational to just bulldoze everyone around you and get what you want, in this selfish way. It's strictly rational from the individual standpoint. If you and I were in line for something, for me to just cut you in line and then threaten to fight you if you wanted to go toe-to-toe about it, and then I win because I get my stuff early. But later, now, we have these new ways of looking at that. And if I'm really being rational, I wouldn't cut you in line because I wouldn't be accounting for all the data. So data point one is, if I cut you in line, I get my food sooner. And that's a benefit, and I want that outcome, so I do it, right? That seems rational. But data point two is, if I cut you in line now and get my food sooner, you will not trust me or like me or share with me if I'm down on my luck. So data point three is, rule, don't cut people in line, even though you want your food as soon as possible. So first come, first serve kind of thing. So if I'm being rational, and I'm quote unquote rational, and I'm getting something, and I'm arriving at a conclusion that is still unsavory, my suspicion is that I'm not accounting for enough data, that there's something else there that I'm not seeing.
So let me ask, like, that's a really good way to put it too. It's like rationality is the you could say ability or whatever. It's like it's this ability to open up to broaden your horizons of the options. Like you're trying to broaden and see the full landscape,
or maybe even to organize them, or a little more active. And again, I'm not in philosophy. There are a couple different types of rationality, but again, being reasonable to me is being more in touch with subjective experiences. I think there's also a Spock-like interpretation where Spock is, supposedly the most logical person that isn't, or mostly is immune to quote unquote emotional states or impulsive, sentimental types of attachments, right? But that is a shortcoming, because then when the situation calls for attention to your subjective state, that's another piece of information that you're missing, right? So yes, we need to do this, that, and the other thing, but we also need it to feel good. So it doesn't, to me, I don't know.
Makes sense.
It's too simple for me to say, not because I demand that it be more complicated. Antonio Damasio also says, we are feeling machines that think, not thinking machines that feel. So there's no like rational inner person where I'm really this rational soul who gets bogged down by my emotions, or I get set back by my disappointments.
I got to look this guy. I got to read more.
He's great. Yeah, he's great.
That sounds awesome.
And he just inspires to me a bigger conversation. And
I did want to ask you though, like, I'm curious, just it's still on the subject.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I didn't talk enough about Sam Harris, but
it's fine. I definitely want to get into Sam Harris for sure. But I love like just the branching off into whatever topic. But the whole, like, even using rationality. So I like what you're saying, and it makes perfect sense. Like, it's organizing data. It's like you're rather than having a very narrow, maybe more selfish perspective, like you said, just cut someone off. That's the most rational thing. It benefits me right now. It's like broadening all the options or the data that's coming in. But then even the example that you said, it has this overarching like goodness attached to it. It seems like it still has this like overarching ultimate well-being attached to it. And I think that's where a lot of the friction comes in with like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, those two crowds is Jordan Peterson would say, see, even using rationality and talking about that, there's this religious element to it, which is like this overarching well-being. And people who go commit like atrocious crimes or do school shootings, like those people probably in their minds, the overarching good is what like this thing that they want to go do. Like in their mind, they're justifying it. Like the Columbine shootings, you can read their journals. Like it's crazy stuff, but like, it's like they're doing justice doing it. And it's just, to me, that's where it starts to get muddy, is that overarching well-being. And this, I guess, is a good segue to Sam Harris, because I know he talks a lot about all this stuff. And I'm not too familiar with, like I'm saying, I've listened to his podcast, I've listened to a lot of his stuff, but I've been listening to it through the lens more of Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like, what Sam Harris is kind of, what's he doing exactly? And like, because you're not going to explain that in like one sentence, but you know what I mean? Like, what are your thoughts on kind of his pursuit?
I see. Yeah. He, when Chris and I were on, I remember just before we talked about the Peterson Harris debates, I did my best to summarize his position and why he and Peterson found each other.
Yeah.
But one of his big theses is the moral landscape thesis, which is that essentially, if we had every piece of information in the known universe or in the universe, if we knew everything there is to know, that would allow us to make perfect ethical decisions. And of course, in principle, that might be true, and in practice, we're set back because we don't have all the information in the known universe. So when he says reason, or how he says how science can determine human values, is I think the subtitle to that book. He means that there's peaks and valleys of ethical decision making, and we are happier and less happy based on those decisions. And the way we get to those peaks or those valleys is by good reasoning. So I think he also sees, I'm guessing he would say it's also more of a system using reason to get to those places. But this is where I also noticed that the strange confusion. Even if I had a religious worldview and I wanted to convince you of it, I'm still giving you reasons to be more like me, or to be more to see it my way.
Yeah, for sure.
And I might be right. And how do I know I'm right? Well, I'm giving reasons.
Yeah.
And until I give you, and rather, when I give you a bad reason, that's when you can push back and you can say, I don't think that reason represents reality the way that I am interested in seeing reality, right?
Yeah.
So Sam would say, if you can dispel illusions about the way the world is, you can see everything clearly, then we could all move together with the knowledge that all of us are different from each other and that we could be anyone at any moment.
Yeah.
So if I were you, I would want to live in a world that's best for you. And if you were me, vice versa.
Yeah.
So again, it's not reasonable to say, well, I'm me, so I want the world to be most suited to me.
Yeah. Because
the minute it's not me, it's least suited for somebody else. And so we all need to do this together.
Yeah.
And so as far as like the book Waking Up and his spiritual side, I think he wants spirituality as a word or as an endeavor to be preserved, so that we don't lose what you might call meaning and purpose and things like that, or fulfillment rather. So he has spent a lot of his life meditating. He's done quite a bit of investigating in ways of subjectively being well. And that's probably what drew him to someone like Antonio Damasio, because Damasio points out that feelings are the impetus for basically every decision. So even the Columbine shooters had a feeling. They had this probably awful, miserable, isolated, hateful feeling.
Victims, that's
Sure, yeah. And however they interpreted that, again, even someone like Peterson isn't transcending reason. He's using he would be, if he were to speak to those boys, he would use reasons and say, look, I'll give you better reasons for taking action.
Yeah.
You think this is a good reason to go shoot up a school, I'll give you a reason not to. And I wish it would have worked, right? And unfortunately, we're not always compelled by good reasons. We have a feeling, and then we have maybe an emotion or an impulse, and then we make a decision that might not be.
That's the struggle, right? Is that subjective feeling that feels like that's the everything, right? That moment, that whatever it is, and that's that's a good. It sounds to me like it's still foggy to me, like just how do you determine the good? Like, how do you determine what is that overarching well-being? You know what I mean? Like, especially if you come from, like, maybe if you're not as knowledgeable as a person and you don't have really broad horizons, like, how do you think in a more grand way about the well-being overall? There's, especially if you're in a situation that's very, like, you have to function from a more selfish perspective to really survive or thrive. I know that, like, this is such a broad question, and it's like it's just philosophy. Like, you could just go down whatever paths, but I think that's the question is, how do you transcend that subjective experience in certain situations? Like, how do you using reason? Because what if you don't have a good, like, what if you're not able to really use reason that well? Do you mean if you are the kind of person who's not good at reasoning, or if you don't have a lot of information? Both, both. Like, if you don't have a lot of information, if you're, just come from a more, like, you didn't finish high school. That's how my parents are. Like, like blue collar. My dad is like a blue collar guy who's I admire him so much, and he's taught me a lot, but he'd never finished high school, and he's more of religious, I guess I would say, but he's coming from that place of, not a ton of knowledge, and anyway, I think you kind of get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think so. And being just in my mind right now, I'm seeing the distinction between being a good person. Well, I'm seeing a couple of distinctions. Being a good person and being a happy person are not always the same. We know people who are
for sure
kind of martyrs, miserable, but they make other people, happy or well off.
For sure.
And also the difference between being kind of handicapped in that way, like being for some reason not having the ability to think clearly about these things.
That's what I'm trying to get at. And I know this is a sensitive subject. Like, I know the whole They talked about it a little bit in one of the debates, Peterson and Harris, and there's a point in one of the debates where Sam Harris said something like, "Stupid people need the religion. Is that what you're saying?" And he said that to Jordan Peterson. He was like, "So you're saying that us smart people up here on stage don't need religion?" And it obviously that's not. I don't think that's what they were saying, but there is that argument of people who don't have this capability of reasoning. Really, like, they're just coming from a lot less. They're coming from limited means, and
I see.
Just
right
in those situations, how, what is it that could help them be more rational?
Yeah, good question. So I can't speak to the sociological problem of people having difficulty navigating the world.
Yeah,
but I would.
I know it's a sensitive subject. I just, it's.
Oh no, it's a great question. To me, the meeting of the worlds with reasoning about the world while also being attuned to your subjective experience is that you can always identify the suffering and you can move away from that.
Yeah, for sure.
And you might be mistaken about how you effectively move away from that. So I know I have thought, oh, well, when I feel this way or when I get this way, I can just do this thing and then that'll solve my problem. And I was wrong. You seek inappropriate or unhealthy ways of either coping with that moment or maybe you're just mistaken about the cause or the reason for your suffering. But like Damasio points out, also when you go to a doctor or when you're talking about medical outcomes, at the end of the day, we basically mean that it changed our subjective feeling. So how do you know a medicine is working? I feel better. I feel different. I don't feel in pain. I don't feel nauseated. I don't feel anxious. And then the doctor goes, okay, great. The doctor doesn't open up your brain and look inside. And similarly, if a doctor prescribed me anti-anxiety meds and I started taking them and I went back to him and I said, Doc, I don't think they're working. I'm still anxious. And he said, no, you're not. That wouldn't make any sense, right? That interaction wouldn't have any value. The client or the patient would say, yeah, I'm still anxious. What do you mean? So we both, me and the doctor, we both know that the currency is my subjective experience. That's what we're dealing with. So again, the doctor would not be strictly quote unquote rational to say, no, you are feeling better.
Gotcha. Like this medication has worked for this amount of people.
You're being rational if you change your patient's subjective feeling. That's what that means. And I'm being rational if my goal is to change my subjective feeling. And then I do.
Gotcha.
But if you change your goals, then it's different. So if I have a goal, so I work in the addiction population, right? With the addiction population. And the problem seems to be for every person that walks in the door to treatment is I have felt a certain way, subjective. I've had this inner experience that is not good, and I have incorrectly or inappropriately treated that subjective feeling experience with something that makes me, in the long run, worse off. So I don't like the consequences of doing this in the long term, but I like them a little too much in the short term.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask you about that. Like, sorry to interrupt. I was going to ask, like, reducing suffering. Like, you feel this way, and you're suffering, and you try to do things to reduce your suffering. And what about people who they think that, and it works short term for some people, like, I'm suffering, so I'm going to make other people suffer. And that's going to reduce my suffering. You're not using your rationality there. And maybe they don't have or I guess it depends on how you define it, but in how, they don't have the means to think about things in such a grand way and think like, well, but making this person suffer is affecting my relationship with them, and then it's going to affect this relationship, and then 10 years from now, whatever it is. Like in those cases, how would you talk to them about it, or how, like, it's a big problem. I mean, that's definitely a big problem is if you're only basing it on, well, reduce my suffering, that's where living an extremely like expedient life where you're just doing things that reduce your suffering right now and the immediate comes into play. And then if, and we've talked a little about, I'm not Christian, but I love delving into Christianity, but that's where religion can help people like that. You bring in religion, you bring in this big, grand story with all these people that have done it, this big community, and it makes them realize, oh, well, this isn't, actually doing this isn't good. And however, there's a lot of not great things with that. But anyway, I'm just like, it's a very interesting subject.
My reaction to that is,
it's very broad.
But I'm wanting to speak carefully so that I say what I mean.
Gotcha.
I agree with, I think the Buddha probably said it maybe first, or since the Buddha's time for thousands of years, that the way to reduce suffering is to see the world as it is. So you suffer when there are phrases in Buddhism that get translated well or not well to English, like greed, hatred, and delusion, or attachment, aversion, and ignorance, would basically be the recipe for suffering. So if you think the world is other than it is, including you and your internal workings, then you will suffer in some way. You'll be attached to something that is going to let you down, or you will rely on something that's not reliable, or you will think that something brings you joy that does not. all sorts of ways, right? Um, and I haven't heard that falsified. I haven't heard an argument against that, I guess.
No, I agree with that. I definitely
Yeah.
agree with that. And that's why I think meditation and things like that are really important.
Yeah.
And people, I think that's why I like having these conversations, try to just talk about this stuff, because I agree with you. I think that's one of the biggest problems with a lot of people's anxiety and being depressed is they have expectations. They have these big expectations, which isn't reality. You set these big expectations in your mind and you think of yourself as some way, but it isn't actually meeting the reality that you're living, and you're just constantly being let down. So I agree with that 100%. I really like the Buddha philosophy for sure. Like even the whole notion that evil is just lack of knowledge or something. Isn't that something like that? I think it's something like that.
It's just, I guess the interpretation would be that evil is just a mistake. It's just someone who is completely mistaken about the good life.
Yeah.
Even on a subjective level, there are some people who will never, someone on the antisocial spectrum, that will never gain from deep, intimate human relationships. That's fine. But even in those cases, it's in your best interest to not piss off everybody around you as well.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about being rational, right? If you were rational and you're a sociopath, you still don't need to feel good about developing trust with other people. You can just feel good about the fact that people don't hate you. And if you make them hate you, you will suffer as well.
Yeah.
So just going back, my worry, it's a worry. It's not, I couldn't make a definitive statement, but my concern when someone is using a story or using a made up description of the world is that it almost by definition is going to have something about it that's not strictly true.
Yeah.
Or that doesn't really represent it might be kind of quote unquote real, but not really real, as they say.
Yeah.
And that someone will be attached to that worldview or that system or that narrative, and that inevitably something in the world will bump up against that.
Yeah, and that
be tension
happens.
there.
I mean, it happens all the time.
So if you pick any one thing, you're picking something that is made up, and it doesn't give you the option of seeing it like a story.
Yeah.
And you could say, I really like this story. So if Peterson is talking about Christianity being literally true, that's strange to me. That I would just question his commitment to that.
Yeah.
But if someone says this is a tool to get you from point A to point B, and you want to be at point B, and you convince me, again, you're being reasonable. You're giving me reasons, and I can sign on to that.
Yeah.
But I also don't like the idea of treating people like childishly, I should say. We're all children, we're all like just big kids who grow up, and we are not great at thinking, and we're bad reasoners, and we're mistaken most of the time about most things.
Yeah.
So in that way, we're like children, but I don't like talking down to people and saying, "Oh, you need this. This story works for you." Like, what it works to get you somewhere, but I'm thinking of the person you were just describing that maybe just has all the cards stacked against them.
Yeah.
Something like a Vipassana meditation, the goal is not to get you away from all those stressful experiences like a vacation. It would be to help you tune in better and to see whatever's going on. Just to observe what is it like for me when I go to work every day. Is it because of my boss or my coworker or the customers? Is it because I hate what I'm actually doing, or do I not really hate it that much? And so insofar as you can see the world clearly, you can do something with that, but you can't do anything with it if you're if there's anything underneath that. Like if your whole world is propped up by something that is made up, you don't have a lot of power there. You don't have any control because you always have to fall back on that story. So reality is going to surface, or the rest of reality is going to surface, and then what?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. And I do think like, I mean, I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this question. I was just thinking about, I think Jordan Peterson would say, I don't know, I don't want to put words in his mouth either, but what I got out of a lot of the stuff he talks about is more like, I don't take Christianity literally true. I definitely don't, but I think of it as tools, just like I guess you could think of rationality as a tool of, like you're saying, trying to see reality just how it is. And then when something comes up that's like, uh-oh, like this sucks. Almost, and I'm curious what you have to say about this, but I think of Christianity more from like, there's a lot of stuff in it that I just don't even pay attention to it, but I'm trying to dive deep into the more like psychological, the more psychological elements of it, like Jordan Peterson in his lectures that he did on the Bible, like, and I can think of Christianity in one of those moments where things surface and it's chaos. I can think, well, psychologically, like what would Jesus do like in this moment? Like in that it's almost like it can just be an anchor it's almost like just a way to remember, have compassion.
I get
like
that.
Have compassion in this moment. It's really easy right now to be selfish. It seems like that's what your emotions are telling you to do, is you got to be selfish right now or you're not going to get what you need, but don't do that. Have compassion. It's like just, I guess, like a reminder, but I'm curious, like what you're like, just the whole idea, meditation and, to get you to see reality how it is. And then in one of those moments where you're seeing reality how it is and it hits you right in the face, what do you do in that moment? Like, how do you react then? Like, like what things or steps can you take? Because I guess that's where religion can come to play with people, is they're good at staying unattached, and they meditate and they can kind of stay calm and they see reality how it is. But then what about they get hit by a car and break their legs? Then it's like, in that moment, what do you do to try to cope with like that type of thing? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So anyway, just curious what you'd think about that kind of thing. Kind of going deep a little bit.
Yeah. I also wouldn't put rationality alongside other like interpretations of the world.
Gotcha.
That
like you wouldn't put it alongside Christianity as a tool.
No, Christianity could be a tool for some things, but like a tool, it does some things and it doesn't do other things. And rationality, I think, it's I don't know. It's a word for a process.
I know it's hard to
it's more like it is the machine, and the you might put Christianity as a filter in that machine.
Oh, that's actually a really good way to put it.
Yeah, like rationality makes is
the process.
Is the oven, and then the Christianity might be the cookie sheet or the shape of the cookie that you get.
Gotcha.
And
That's a good way
I'm
to
sure
put
there's
it.
a better analogy, but something like, if you want star-shaped cookies, you can press them with the Christianity tool and then get them that way. But if you want something else, or if you just want to know what are cookies made of, you can't necessarily go to any one of those tools. Like if I were a carpenter and I were using a certain type of saw as a tool, I might ask myself, wait, why am I building anything in the first place? And that's a different question. And I guess I would, for the person that needs to remind themselves in that moment what to do, I can, in symbolic logic, there's like a conditional statement would be like, if P, then Q. Like Christianity might say, if you are feeling angry with somebody, then you must exercise compassion. But you can get Q through a lot of means.
Yeah.
You can go to a lot of religions and life philosophies emphasize compassion.
Yeah. And when I say Christianity, any religion you can put into place of that, when I'm kind of talking about it.
Totally. So unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, you can get that compassion basically anywhere. But if you asked a Christian, well, why is that such a good thing? Why do you need compassion? Why would Jesus talk about compassion? Why would that even be a normative statement? Why didn't you read the Bible and read about Jesus's compassion and then conclude, oh, Jesus was a really awful guy? Why not? Why is the devil the awful guy? this is I think it's called the Euthyphro argument, where back Plato would write about, there was a dialogue where Socrates was saying, is it good because the gods said it was good, or did the gods say it's good because it's good?
Yeah.
So people have been asking this stuff for a long time.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you still make up your mind, and you still have to, you kind of made up the goal of be compassionate, and you have again reasons why that's a good thing. So it's not that religious of a conclusion. It's made up in terms of, we make up our own ethics because we're humans, and those ethics might not apply to plants, but we just agreed being compassionate is a good thing. We want people to be peaceful and get along with each other.
Yeah.
So we can do this thing that also, hey, there actually 2,000 years ago, there was a guy who also did that.
Yeah.
And that's a nice story. But
that's the question, right? Is like, I think compassion it's amazing how much a little act of compassion can completely change the dynamic. Like, we've talked a little bit about how I went from like dreading my job and like just what I wasn't happy, and I had this filter of how I saw the whole situation, and I just had a moment of, I guess it was removing the filter and seeing it for what it was, and having a lot of appreciation, and completely changing the whole dynamic. And a lot of it had to do with compassion, just having like the little moments of compassion. So I do think like that's a extremely important thing to remember, is if someone is like treating you like shit and being an asshole, they're probably feeling like shit themselves. Have a little bit of compassion. Anyway, I don't want to go too far into that, or we can, but that's the question, is like, it's really hard for people to have compassion. Like, a lot of people struggle so much to have compassion, and for good reasons. I mean, and I guess that's the question, is like, religion, ideologies, like, help those people see it in a deeper way, that the importance of it, like, answers that question, why have compassion? Because some people say, why have compassion? Nihilistic people, like, people say life is meaningless, everything is meaningless, I'm just a little speck, what's the point? Like, why have compassion for other people? It's pointless, we're all going to die, there's no reason, so I'm just going to make sure I take care of myself and not have compassion, and that's what I'm going to do with my life. And so I guess that's where all that comes into play. And like, I'm trying to delve into why have compassion and not think about it from a religious perspective, and I practice it every day, and it has helped me immensely. And I think it is the way to go. But there are people that struggle with it, and I guess how do you help? Like, what approaches are there? And I know you're huge into meditation. You've been talking about it. Do you think that's like a way to? Do you think meditation would help people with that?
Of course.
You think it would like really help people see the benefits of that?
It doesn't cure every ailment. Maybe I haven't made this also clear, because I'm just throwing stuff out there that interests me. But
which is I love that.
Yeah, the seeing reality as it is not some perfect system where you develop this magical psychic power of, well, I meditate and now I see the world perfectly. We all suck at this a lot, right? Everyone is a bad meditator by definition, because humans are bad at sustaining your attention. But I like that it gives it pushes pause in that moment where you don't just act and you don't just do something automatically. So if you're too busy thinking about what is really going on and what your reaction is to the world, you're not then doing the Columbine thing and just going for it and just acting and going, well, I feel hatred, so I'm going to act out my hatred. And even, this might sound strange, but even really, really well-intended actions are sometimes not the right thing to do. And not because they're bad, I should say, not because they're unethical. This might be premature or not really well thought out. And all the time, I'll do something thinking that it's a good idea, or thinking, oh, this will help, and then it doesn't. And but if you dial it back and just start again, going back to the feeling itself first, and then the inner fact becomes another fact, and then the observation becomes another fact, and then noticing the observation as a fact, and then you just have this expanding circle, and before you know it, you didn't actually have to do anything. You didn't have to really change that moment.
I think that's what I experienced at my job. And now I'm just trying to like understand what happened. But that's like what you're talking about is like what it was.
Yeah.
You know,
Like micromanaging is a good example. No one likes micromanaging, but everyone says they don't like micromanaging. So why does anyone do it? So the person who is micromanaging might think, well, I'm just being helpful. I'm just trying to make things better in the moment so that they don't blow up. Or so they are just. It's just a different radar from the person who they are micromanaging. They're just saying, well, I'd rather you do this correctly here instead of this big. When, again, maybe that's the way to do it. Or maybe if they said, well, what would happen if I just left it? I would feel uncomfortable. Yeah. Is that a good reason to do things? Maybe, right? Yeah. And then you might notice that if you let things go, things will be just fine. And you might have spared a lot of grief by not micromanaging that person, and so everyone chooses somewhere, right? Yeah,
for sure. I was just going to say that's for sure true. I used to be not good at, I used to not point things out when I needed to, micromanage is a very necessary thing. I guess it depends on the job and the situation, but I mean, man, I love like going into what we're going into right now. This is awesome. I'm just curious, like, I don't know how to ask this question. I had a couple of questions that kind of pertain to meditation specifically. I have first off, what do you think about this idea of people needing validation?
Needing validation.
Just, and like, to me, it seems like Chris and I talked about it a little bit. We kind of went into how Christianity for a lot of people is this source of ultimate validation. Like you get your validation from God. You no longer need to get validation from other people. You don't need it from social media. You don't need it from whatever it is. God gives you your validation. You're good to go. And it's a very interesting topic to me. Like this people's need for validation.
What would you need validation for?
I guess people, I mean, that's a good question, right? You could say, you need validation to feel good about yourself. Even just something as simple as that. Like,
what would that mean? If you feel good about yourself,
I guess what does that mean? That's a good question. I guess it would mean you feel like special. I guess you can get to the place where it's like a selfish thing.
And why would you need to feel special?
I guess to make you feel motivated to continue going through whatever struggle you're going through in your life. Okay.
And
I love that you're asking me questions.
Would you need to feel special to be motivated?
I think some people do. Yeah. I think some people for sure. I know I struggled with it for a long time, feeling like I definitely was in search for that validation. We talked about it on the last podcast for sure. And it was like a huge, I'm not perfect, but it was a huge revelation for me, realizing that I gotta fucking let go of needing validation. Like I gotta let that shit go. Like that's toxic. It's not good when it's like your source for like functioning. And so that's why I do like delving into it, because I went through that experience for a long time, wasn't at all aware of it. That's what I was doing, was like my relationships were a source of validation. My job was a source for validation, whatever it was. Yeah. And then realizing, let go of all this. You'll never get validation. Like it's impossible. People can't give you validation. No one can give you your validation. You have to, if you want to get like new agey with it, you have to find the validation within yourself. You can't expect other people to give it to you. But anyway, like Christianity for some people is like when they accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and their Savior, it's like getting that ultimate validation. And what was I asking? Oh, meditation. I was asking about meditation because I actually had this question here. Like, do you think meditation, I guess it just connects directly to everything you're talking about, could help people see or help people feel like they don't need the validation?
Possibly, yeah.
And what do you think about that idea of people needing validation? I like the questions you're asking me. I mean, it's like, it's definitely, it's like you see it all the time. Social media, all these people, just everything they're doing on social media is validation, posting naked pictures, whatever it is. Like it's all like validation. And the question is like, why? Why do people, what is up with that? It's a
Yeah,
big thing.
I,
It's such a
I
broad
wonder.
topic.
It is. It's true, but it's very human. I I wonder what the world would be like if people didn't need to feel important
Yeah,
in
that's the
general.
question.
Do you?
Needing to feel important.
I completely understand. I'm not immune to this, like I said, but I I s- since
Good
having
question.
started meditating, also there's a phrase, there's a selflessness that is pointed to that you lose in like ancient Buddhism, especially. There are all these anecdotes and stories about people um, being enlightened because they realize that there is no ego or there's no self.
Yeah.
There's nothing else. You are your experiences, right?
Yeah.
So um, when you dig, there's not really a ghost in the machine. That there's not a homunculus in there waiting to be validated. So the experience of validation can give you a nice little surge of self-importance, but then it wears off and then
Yeah.
you need another hit. So with the person who looks to God, um, sure, great. If you feel like a truly better person, be a better person.
Just to interject really quick, just
Yeah.
while it's on my mind.
Yeah.
I specifically at a meetup that I went to, this other meetup called Beer and God. Really cool. Anyone interested in, like, it's a very open meetup. It isn't like there's no pushing of religion. It's just this guy who's a pastor, just has this meetup where we drink some beer, play some games, talk about religion very openly. I come from it from like the perspective of I'm interested in the psychology and the metaphors of it, curious what everyone there has to say. But we did specifically talk about this like this dichotomy of validation, and a lot of people think a lot of people have this struggle, from what I was understanding. A lot of people have this struggle with, they see religion as a way to, I guess Christianity specifically, because this is what we talked about in this meetup, but Christianity, there's all this dogma attached to it, and it's this way of validating yourself as like, I'm a better person, I'm good, I'm following all these rules, there's this dogma, and I'm doing these things, and it makes me a better person, and you're getting your validation. But what this guy was saying, this preacher was saying, if you actually really are understanding Christianity and really understanding what Jesus was saying, he would be saying that it's actually about ridding yourself of the ego, and like, and realizing that you shouldn't be trying to live your life purely to try to validate yourself. Like you shouldn't be doing that. And I'm just curious, like, I know, like you said, people's need to feel important, it's definitely a big struggle for a lot of people. And I'm just, I don't know. I don't know what questions to ask, but it's like a topic that I love to dive into.
Yeah.
What were you saying? I'm so sorry I interrupted
No, that's
you. I
great.
totally
Yeah.
forgot. You said something that triggered me thinking about that, and then I forgot why I brought that up. I was going to ask you something.
If you discover that
Ego,
you don't really need it
you.
in the first place,
Yeah.
that changes a lot of the discussion. So I would maybe encourage people to investigate that first. Why do I
need?
Why am I taking it for granted that this is a quote unquote need versus just a desire? And have you ever desired something that you realized you really didn't want, or that wasn't really good for you, or that you didn't really need?
Yeah.
And even why the attachment to Christianity? Why, for example, I'm not a Buddhist, right? I'm not an ist of any religion. So just, it might be nice to find a lot of those things in a particular doctrine of some sort.
Yeah. I think the community of it too, for some people.
That too, yeah.
Just that community,
But if it would bother you if tomorrow it all got thrown out and you had all the same ideas and benefits, but without that story, if that would bother you, I would want to know why. And I'm guessing it would bother Peterson. I think he thinks from what he said, that there's something truly unique about Christianity.
Yeah.
And I don't know why.
Yeah. God, it is such a like.
He's explained what he likes about it.
Yeah,
and
I would really
he
love.
said why he thinks it can be applicable to life, but a lot of things can be applicable, and I think you can dial it way back.
Yeah.
And and maybe if I'm really being empathic, I mean, the way Peterson talks, he's got a sense of humor, but he's not a very funny guy.
Yeah.
You know, he's not a joyous guy.
No.
He's very solemn.
Yeah, for sure.
And very serious. And life
He talks
has
about
not
his
been
struggle
great.
with depression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And stuff way out of his hands.
Yeah.
I mean, he's done a lot,
Yeah.
you know? So I commend him. And so it seems like the Columbine shooters may be the perfect audience for him. The other serious, disenfranchised, depressed people.
Yeah.
And outside, so if I find a story that prevents me from committing a mass shooting, then just as an ethical citizen, I want that to be out there and available. And some people find Franz Kafka, and some people find Jesus, and some people find UFO theories.
Yeah.
Whatever. But if I'm really being honest, just the mental health connection, if you're not able to see the world as it is, there's a vulnerability there, and it could surface as suffering.
Yeah.
And I do my damnedest every day, and I try not to have opinions that are going to really offset my worldview and set me up for more suffering.
Yeah.
So Robin Hansen said it at a Q&A one time. Someone asked him his opinion about something that was not his area of expertise, and he said, I'm not going to answer that question. And frankly, I don't think anyone else should. I think we should have fewer opinions. And I kind of liked that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious to ask you, if you don't mind sharing, like, do you have, like, what's your worldview?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and just
I don't know. It changes all the time.
Yeah,
and lately I've been trying to take less for granted. To be more skeptical about buzzwords and things that seem really attractive.
Gotcha.
That sounds good. That really encapsulates what I think. Yeah. To be within myself, to be more suspicious of my own motivations for feeling important or knowledgeable or something like that, or an authoritative source on something, versus just speaking for myself. This is what I love about group therapy also, is that there's a way for everyone to have a reaction to something, or a thought about something, or contribution, I should say, without it meaning anything more than whatever, however they thought of it. So there could be 10 people in a group, all of whom disagree and maybe don't even like each other that much. But someone could say something like, when you said that, I really didn't like that. It sounded kind of inconsiderate or arrogant. And the person could say, I didn't mean it like that. I actually was trying to blah, blah, blah. And another person could say, yeah, I didn't interpret it that way. And everyone is speaking honestly, straightforwardly, awesome. But they're not, it doesn't imply anything.
Yeah.
And we're still all speaking from our own circle, and just like I said, not taking anything for granted, and not assuming that anything's true.
That sounds awesome. Like group therapy, having all those different perspectives.
It's a good experience.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just like, I definitely think I'm glad we started going into this stuff. I mean, it's a big thing. I think you said it perfectly, that like Jordan Peterson's audience, and I experienced that for sure. I think it's becoming more clear to me the more I'm actually like consciously stepping away from Jordan Peterson, not in a bad way, but just like expanding, branching out, just kind of like analyzing a lot of the stuff he says. The more I realize, I think that is a lot of his audience, and the whole young men, is the disenfranchised, these people that feel invalid, it really is. And I think there's a lot of people that struggle with that. And I think us like going deep into this, and that's what helped me. It's crazy. I discovered Jordan Peterson, right? And it helped for a little bit. And then a year went by of going back and forth. And then I had that not good moment, right? I hit rock bottom, and it took me really having this rock bottom moment of realizing like, like I talked about before, and since our last podcast, a lot has changed. A lot that I've been thinking about has like really changed with a lot of the stuff. But I think really trying to do my best to rid myself of my ego. So that's such a like broad thing, but trying to like rid myself of my ego, which I guess means stop taking shit personally. Stop trying to like, like stop trying to outdo, don't compete, like do the best you can do, learn as much as you can, help if you can other people, and be as authentic as you possibly can. Like that's kind of where I'm at right now. And trying to, having that perspective, it's just like, man, it helps so much. It's helped me day to day, just being very aware and practicing like being as aware as I possibly can of ego or whatever you want to call that. It's the same thing as like need for validation. Like if you're at work and there's someone that kind of intimidates you, someone that is more competent than you or whatever, you very easily can compete with them and your ego comes out. And yeah, just my experience with that is like being as aware as I can be of those moments and like taking the step to consciously not let that side of me come out.
Yeah.
Just be authentic. Like that's what I've been trying to do is like,
certainly
stop fucking like caring so much about what people think. Just be authentic. Like, this podcast is like, oops, we keep hitting, I got to get a better location for these things. I've done that like twice. Just, wanting to just really dive into this stuff at this point is what this podcast is about. It's like just really trying to like understand. It's so funny because before this podcast, I was like, I don't want this podcast to just be this like heavy, deep, but it like we went there, but it's awesome. Like this has been awesome. But anyway, I'm rambling. I forgot what I was even saying. But
well, can I challenge two things that you said?
Yeah.
One is not caring what people think. It sounds like you care a lot what people think, not in a bad way, but that you want to make a good impression.
Oh, for sure.
You want to be attentive. You want people to feel cared about.
I guess I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm going to have to think about it, what I mean more by that. I guess what it was before was caring about like this image that I wanted to have of myself. Like this way that I wanted to be to people. And it's like the expectation. And so I think it's impossible to say, stop caring. Like you don't care about what people think. It's like impossible to not care what people think. But I think, I think it's more about now. It's like, you always care what people think, but it's like caring about what people think, I guess, of like, I'm really trying to just be my authentic self. Like I'm really trying to like let go of some image that I have of myself, of how I want to be. And before, that's what it was. It really was. It was like, I want to be this competent. Even on that first podcast, there's shit that I said that since then I've really thought about and like be this really competent, hardworking, like always getting after it, always going like super, super, super. Now it's like, it's crazy. Like I've had since doing this podcast has helped me so much in my life. Like it's crazy. Like it's really helped me so much. But I've really stepped back a little bit and taken it easy and like really started to realize even a lot of that stuff was all about validation. All makes that sense. Like exercise every single day, do this diet, get up at 4 a.m. every single day. And a lot of it was validation. I was making myself feel like this more competent person, this, this. And now doing the things that I do, still like getting up early and stuff, it's way more about like, it legitimately just makes me feel happy. Like now doing this conversation, working on whatever thing I'm editing or whatever. Now it's definitely more focusing on shifting it to be about, I actually get joy out of this. And it's not about like the validation from it. Because you keep failing. Your expectations will never be met. They're always going to change. But what was your other question? You said the validation thing.
That made me want to say something before I asked you about the other thing.
Yeah.
That I also wanted to, I had trepidation about wanting to think out loud in a space like the internet, where something goes up and then it's out there. And I'm conscious of not wanting to misrepresent myself or not giving the wrong idea about something that I think or something that interests me, not being something that I necessarily endorse. and then similarly not wanting to endorse something that might apply to me today but won't apply to me tomorrow, and I want that to be okay.
Yeah.
So so I'm thankful that basically that you asked me in the first place, and that there's a forum like this, because I even feel different than I did when we started today. And that just the act of taking that risk a little bit, of course it's safe. We could turn this all off and never, put up. But assuming that this all ends up online, that somebody's going to be listening to this, there are, I'm sure, things I've said that I wish I didn't say in that way, or that maybe I wasn't so sure that if I had to do this 10 more times, I would refine that sentence or that thought, and maybe even change my mind completely about it.
Yeah.
So because I want it to be okay for people to change their minds and not tie them down to something like it's a court case, to be forgiven, charitable interpretations, all those great features of relationships, that I'm changed at every moment, all the time. Every time I say something, I'm changing my own thought about that thing.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're talking about that. This is awesome. Like, I really do want this podcast, like, to be much more than just like what you're saying is actually describing exactly how I want this to be for me, for the people come on. I thank you so much for coming on. Like, I really do appreciate it. And same for me. Like, it's scary sometimes to put yourself out there and you want to say things. And to be fucking honest, like, my mind changes every day. And at this point, I'm just like, I'm just thinking that's what I want this to be about, rather than trying to have this be some like thing where I'm pushing these ideas and I'm presenting myself as some like perfectly articulated person. It's like, this is a journey where I'm learning. Like, there are things, like you said, that I probably said 20 minutes ago, and I'll listen to it like, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's so much more meaningful to be in this moment with you and to like just say things as I feel it and learn from it. Like, just earlier, you're asking me questions where I was like, he's fucking making me really think about this in real time right now. And I really love that. Like, I do want that.
I won't stop.
Yeah. Keep doing it. And I do want it to be like that. And this really has changed me in that way of trying to get more and more in touch with my authentic self or whatever. Like, meditation is.
Well, that was my second question. So I'm challenging that phrase, but this also goes back to what you had asked about meditation. Instilling compassion. So through, let's say, just a awareness, mindfulness meditation, it's surprising how much happens in your head without your volition, that you didn't decide. I don't sit down, and I guess that is the whole meditation, is that that's why they call it a practice, is you're practicing being more deliberate about your attention. And yet your mind will produce whatever it produces completely out of your control. And it's just a runaway train of everything that you've ever experienced, and every memory and every worry. And then you'll feel tired, and then you'll feel energetic, and you'll get antsy, and you'll think about the time. And if we really just got to choose the way our minds worked, we wouldn't need to practice the meditation, because we would just sit and we would do it perfectly, and then we would get up and be unchanged. So anyway, my question is, what is an authentic self?
Good question. I guess, like, let me think about this for a second. I got to put some like filler music in here when we're doing our thinking about
That's
stuff.
Okay, just think. Yuval Harari, by the way, in interviews, if someone asks him a question that he's not absolutely positive about, he'll say, "Let me think for a second."
Yeah. I want to get better at doing that.
Long time.
Yeah.
That's a great practice.
I guess I'm going to just try to explain this. It's going to be sloppy, but the feeling is it's almost like when I feel more in touch with my authentic self, it's weird because it's almost more reactionary. It's like when someone says something to me, that first reaction is what I go with, rather than someone says something, I think about it. I think about what I want to say to make them feel a certain way. And then I think about how I'll sound saying that. And then I think about what is the outcome. And I think about am I gonna, whatever, and you start putting all these filters on it. It's like what now I'm trying to do is really just feel that first thing. And that doesn't mean go with it. It just means feel it. What's that first initial emotion that comes up in some situation, some altercation with someone, or even not even that, just in your day-to-day life, like that real core first initial emotion is kind of what I'm trying to get more in tune with. And that's not that, like I said, it doesn't mean the first reaction is getting angry and then going with the anger. It's like the first reaction is getting angry, sit with that for a second, don't react to it. That's what I mean. It's weird. It's like saying it's more reactionary. It isn't. I guess it's just more being in tune with that first kind of whatever emotion that pops up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like trying to be more aware of that. And then not, I guess, trying to be more aware of that, and then not trying to like manipulate that in some, like I've struggled with that. Like someone makes me feel stupid, so I'll try to outdo that and compensate for it. Now it's like, just go with it. I feel stupid for a reason. Why do I feel stupid? And why do I have to feel shitty that I feel stupid? And just learn from whatever it is, stuff like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, why would you call that authentic versus inauthentic?
I guess I would call it authentic because it's like obviously I'm not perfect, but I guess it would be because there is no filters that I'm consciously putting onto it. Like I'm feeling this emotion, and then I'm not like consciously deciding, oh, subdue this, try to sound smart right now. It's like kind of try, and obviously this sounds like super philosophical or whatever, but it's like, I guess that's why I'd say it's more authentic, because it's me deciding to not consciously like manipulate it, but you have to, I mean, you still have to, but I guess just being more aware of that and like really trying to, I don't know if that's making sense. Literally, I'm thinking in real time right now.
But there's something, tell me if I'm getting this right. There's something that feels inauthentic about putting a filter on it, or if you have a goal that feels inauthentic.
I guess that maybe is more what it is. It's not like, I don't think it is inauthentic putting a filter. I think it's inauthentic when you're not being honest with yourself about the filter, or about like trying to compensate. Like if someone makes you feel stupid, what would be inauthentic is like not being honest with yourself that maybe you are a little ignorant, whatever subject it is, and then trying to lie, and then trying to make yourself sound smarter than you are. I guess that's the route you can easily go down.
Yeah.
And so I guess if that makes sense, it's not really like, I don't think it's inauthentic. You have to put filters on. You have to like do these kinds of things in life, especially if you're working in some situation with a bunch of different people. You can't just go with the flow in every moment, but I guess just being more in touch with that first initial emotion, and then trying to think about it like objectively, rather than from the place of like trying to just make myself feel better. Just like like what you probably do as a therapist, like, well, why did I feel that way? Why did him saying that make me feel that way? And try not to be too attached to it, whatever it is. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
So in meditation, it's crazy.
Yeah.
How much it helps with kind of trying to just be more aware,
Yeah, I notice how little I can really even account for my own reactions, and how I didn't really have control over any of it. I didn't choose to be, let's say if I'm an angry person, and I'm just always, there's just a hair trigger response, and I just get upset all the time. And I didn't necessarily choose to be that person. And then even if I get better at not being angry, I didn't necessarily choose that. So I might even notice that the filter itself is something that originated with me, but I can't point to the moment where I took that on and I thought, I'm harnessing my anger. Like almost like the anger is not me, but the harnessing is. Gotcha. Like I'll take credit for the good thing, and not, but really none of it. And so as far as having compassion also for other people, I think if somebody is really angry and they're trying not to be angry and they're still bad at it, I can get on their case for it. And it doesn't mean that it's not consequential, because if someone's angry and they're pissing everybody off by being angry, that's actually a problem. But
Sure.
but I can feel for that person, in that if I was them, I would be them.
Yeah.
And if I were more angry, I'd be more angry.
Yeah.
And I can't take credit per se for just being a not angry person.
Yeah.
And I noticed, I think I noticed, especially recently, in recent years, my competitive drive has reduced, a lot, almost completely. And already by nature, I do a lot of solitary or kind of individual activities and hobbies and things like that. Stuff that you don't need to organize a ton of people. But it's not. I don't have that spark of winning, and I also don't feel the defeat of losing nearly to the extent that I used to.
Yeah.
I'm not a blank slate, but I remember being very competitive as a younger person, really loving to come out on top in certain ways, and I notice it hasn't impacted my edge for development or for growth.
I mean, I'm curious to dive into that a little bit. I think that's something that people worry about is, well, if I stop caring about this competition and competing, I'm not gonna have this drive to continue to be successful.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
What was your journey like with kind of going?
I kind of
from
noticed
that?
on accident. I just stopped wanting to, I guess a good example would be just playing games for game's sake. If I were sitting around with 4 people who I enjoy and I love and I want to get to know, or they're friends of mine, that's good enough. And that's also probably a personality and temperament correlation for me, just because I like being social.
Yeah.
But I didn't really need the game. I didn't really want the game to be the structure and the rules and the winning and the losing and the. I notice it just brings out the worst in people.
Gotcha. Alrighty. So we paused it for a second because they're like redoing a room or something down the hall. I don't think it's going to be a problem. So what were you saying? You're still talking about that.
Oh, about competition
Yeah.
and stuff. Yeah, I think what I just started to notice was that I didn't really want to create a kind of winner loser situation, and it started to. It didn't instill. It really didn't motivate me, I guess I should say. After you spend enough time basically reducing your need for constant outside, if you want to call it validation, or like feeling important, basically, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't miss it either. It wasn't something that I felt like it was a loss. Like, oh, I really miss those days when I could play Monopoly for 6 hours and win and be different, or that soreness of losing, or whereas if I wanted to get good at something or start a new endeavor, I noticed I was just as motivated as ever. And there's as they say, there's a tide that raises all boats, where everyone can win in a situation where, if everyone is trying to do something useful for everyone else, or everyone's trying to benefit people by developing, let's say it's a new software, or it's a new, art is a great example, right? I don't make movies to beat everybody else. I make a movie so I can entertain people, or so that I can produce something that represents the way that I feel, or something I want to convey to people. And there's really no downside to that. So if someone shows you their piece of music, they're in a band, or they start writing music, my guess is people don't come to you and say, here, I wrote this music. Would you mind telling me who it's better than? Tell me all the artists who you think are worse than my band.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but that's, some people are like that, but
Yeah, maybe
some people,
I don't meet those people
Yeah.
on purpose,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
We don't
for
like
sure.
to be around those people. We don't want that. We
100%.
don't identify with. I mean, largely.
yeah.
I mean, maybe I've gotten lucky. I've met people that like to produce for its own sake.
Yeah. I think that's such
yeah.
a, I mean, I have become more motivated now, actually, letting go of like that need for, and obviously I'm not perfect, but it's more motivating now to keep doing the stuff I'm doing, not like letting go of the expectations, I guess is another way to put it. I just get joy out of doing this stuff, and it's so more motivating because there, like anyone says, to make anything successful or to do anything successful, you have to like take massive action, and you're going to fail, and you're going to fail. A lot of people give up, and they give up because they're not getting the validation from it. And the people usually, whatever, this is just what, like the cliche, but the people that become successful, a lot of them say, just don't give up, just don't stop. That's kind of a part of becoming successful at anything you do, is just don't stop. You just got to keep doing it, become disciplined in it. And I think that's like, it sounds like you're saying, I'm curious, did you think you almost became more motivated when you kind of let go of?
In some way. Well, I noticed in my personal life, a lot of my relationships changed pretty quickly. That how would I describe that? I became more sensitive to that competitive type of behavior.
Yeah.
And I think I stopped just letting myself off the hook too, where if I thought there was any ego-driven reason for doing something, you kind of you notice that very quickly.
For sure.
And like I said, I'm not this perfect, I don't know, enlightened guru who just waltzes around and doesn't need anything. And I'm tempted in all the same ways as any human.
Yeah. But the awareness, right? It's such an important part.
Yeah, you can actually do something with it.
Yeah.
And I was, and there are certain emotions that have also, that we've outgrown, like let's say anger or rage or jealousy. It's not really obvious that the world would be a worse place if we didn't experience those things. Imagine never being jealous again and think, what would you lose by that? And my hunch, again, if somebody were to say, oh, well, these things, or maybe if I weren't jealous, then I wouldn't work as hard. I might wonder, why are you working? Was that all it took? It was that frail of a foundation that it just all crumbles when you're not competing with the next person.
Sure.
And not that friendly, let's both do something worthwhile kind of way. You can encourage each other. Kind of like being in a band and helping each other write the best music. You all benefit because you all get to share that product, right?
We're back. There's, like I said, there's some, what is it, water? Spraying some water gun or something? Whatever that sounds.
I think they're getting rid of and repainting.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's crazy.
Area.
I think the room they're cleaning, that I don't know if we talked about this at all. I had those neighbors that literally every day would be fighting. Like they were like brutally
they got
just
evicted.
yelling at
that
each
was
other.
The sign on
That's
the door,
it.
so.
Yeah. That's what happens.
I guess so.
Yeah, so I think that's so, I think you're just talking about like what I've been going through like this past, year, like what you're kind of talking about with you is what I've been talking about. And it's been a profound just change, letting go of all that stuff, just really trying to figure out like what Jordan Peterson would say, find meaning. And I had a guest on, Mary, who would say like she actually thinks pursuing happiness is like you should pursue happiness. What do you think about that, by the way? Like
the word happiness?
Yeah, I guess just I know that's very general, but
also,
that whole
big question.
That whole like dichotomy of pursue meaning, pursue happiness.
I see.
What do you kind of think about that? I for the longest time I was like, yeah, pursuing meaning is what you need to do, and I do believe that. Like you got to find that thing that will get you through the really hard, like rough days. But it is important to figure out the things that bring you joy, that you actually really do feel happiness, in doing or whatever it is. And anyway, just curious because
I guess my really brief reaction is that the pursuit of happiness seems kind of rhetorical in a way, that the happiness is the pursuit, the way I understand it. That it's more of a verb than a noun. I think I mentioned that in a previous episode. We were talking about what you do is the thing. It's not like where you get to. You're not just like being in a good mood.
That's the confusion, I guess, that a lot of people have, is they think happiness, it's like a drug. take the drug and you feel it.
Yeah, or that it's like a state of elation where you're just happy and then you're not.
Yeah.
Where you might be overjoyed about something and then you're not overjoyed about it, but you're still happy. And so I guess I would encourage people to really think about that. And maybe the word is another case where we have a word for something that might not really exist the way that we understand it, where there might not be a place where happiness is found, where we just go, oh, trust me, now I'm happy. Now
I mean, that's something I think about is the definition of happiness, because I don't know. To me, it seems like happiness is like an emotion, like any other emotion. It's not. It's just an emotion. It's like something that arises when you have a moment or situation where like things come in line perfectly. It's like an emotion that arises. To me, meaning is more like what you're saying. The actual like process of the doing is like, if you can figure out like how to like be aware of the process and the doing of it and that fulfilling you, then happiness, or like its peaks. Anyway, that's how I think about it. So I think you're onto something, saying like the word
something
probably
like
isn't like a good description of like whatever it actually is that you're feeling. And I think that's the case probably for a ton of words that we have. There's more to it,
Yeah. And just as another plug, and maybe even I should just clarify, I feel because it's you and I are talking and just having this conversation, I'm noticing that I'm just talking about things that interest me, basically, the things that I think about. But I want this all to have the frame as, I want it to have the framework of, these are things that I'm trying to do better. And I don't want to sound like an authoritative source on these like the end all, what's the definition of happiness? Here, I got it.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't feel really the most qualified person to speak about any of these things, except for my own reactions to them.
Yeah.
So
that's what I want. That's what I like about this, is like we're just exploring these ideas right now in real time. And I really value your perspectives. I mean,
thank you.
You've helped me a lot. This podcast has helped me so much as doing it.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
Well, we're about at 2 hours at this point. That flew by.
I agree. I agree.
That felt like an hour.
Right.
That was crazy.
Yeah.
But you got to come back on again.
Sure.
I think
My
you
pleasure.
just need to be a regular guest if you're down with that.
Oh,
That'd
yeah.
be awesome.
No problem.
So thank you so much, Hunter.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll do it again.
Yep, for sure.
Cool.
Thank you.